Difficulty in gaming. It's a topic that rears its head in the mainstream with every release from Software, due to both the Western industry and press possessing a seething hatred for anything that goes against what their statistic, marketability, tells them should succeed, or their own inability to easily consume the latest hit content by holding forward. However, that topic is one I've long since addressed, and don't have any interest diving back into it at the moment. That being said, the conversation has got me thinking about an actual interesting question to do with difficulty. And that's of games that do go the route of multiple difficulty selections. Which ones handle it the best? By the title, you already know the conclusion I've come to. But before we get into that answer, let's first get a better understanding of how I evaluate the question, as well as my own mindset toward difficulty. So let's walk back to games designed around being challenging, as it's probably the easiest way to illustrate this criteria. The reason I'm strongly in the camp that these sorts of experiences don't need difficulty options, or feel that forcing them is actively detrimental for said games, is authorial intent. And that's the part we want to focus on. For example, when making FromSoft's various titles, the director Hidetaka Miyazaki has stated numerous times he believes difficulty to be part of the narrative storytelling. To put it simply, it's an oppressive world and the gameplay speaks to that. As such, the game's vision would ultimately be weaker without this. However, not all games have that focus on difficulty. As a matter of fact, the vast majority don't. A lot of games simply want you to experience the narrative, a form of immersion, or simply having fun without any other compromising factors. So that's what today's topic is about. This isn't an all-encompassing answer for every situation, but just those games, where challenge isn't part of the core equation. So without further ado, let's talk about Kingdom Hearts. Kingdom Hearts is obviously entranced in the whimsy of the Disney films that make up its universe. How could it not be? So making it hard would be antithetical. The intent of this series is the experience of the story, the characters, the worlds. Seeing the faces you've loved since childhood in this once crazy idea to mesh Final Fantasy elements into them. And for games with these types of priorities, I find myself sticking to that normal difficulty, despite me always campaigning for those hard games. In my experience, developers when designing games with difficulty options don't give much thought to the harder or lower difficulties. They always seem to overtune too much in each direction, most likely not to the fault of just the developers themselves. They probably don't have the time or budget, but regardless, the end result is easy difficulties that have no challenge whatsoever, or hard difficulties that fall to the other end, feeling far more tedious than anything, with ballooning enemy HP bars. While the normal intended difficulty usually has what's closest to a nice curve. A game that starts out easier and gradually grows, becoming more challenging, testing you more and more on the game's mechanics and skills. So yeah, normal difficulty is the go-to in my experience, and I assume for most of you watching this video, that's where you usually end up as well. Normal naturally just seems the most enticing as the first choice by name alone. That all being said, Kingdom Hearts 2 does not fall into that category for me, despite it clearly seeming like it would. In fact, I go all the way to critical, which is the game's hardest difficulty. And that's because yes, while everything I just said about the intent of Kingdom Hearts is true, the original Tokyo-based team that made the series knew they had something special on their hands, and not just with the idea behind the game, but the action combat they created. Looking back at Kingdom Hearts 1 briefly, we can already see this. They kept returning to that original release. In a manner of speaking, it came out 3 distinct times. The original Japanese release, the international one, that added and tweaked content, and the final mix version, which added on top of that. The difficulty in the game being one of the things that got changed throughout these releases. And right off the bat, a thing I appreciate about Proud Mode, the hardest difficulty at the time, was that it didn't affect your damage in the core game, or the enemy's HP. Typically, the go-to values to edit with higher difficulties, which in turn leads to the issue I mentioned, enemies often becoming damage sponges, making many encounters mind-numbingly boring, not hard. What it does edit, however, is the enemy's damage, doubling it. This, in contrast, just means you won't be caught in a loop of monotony. You will just be punished harder for mistakes, meaning you can make less. Less being a key word there, as you won't be getting one shot out of nowhere, as it happens all too frequently in games that just tweak numbers without reevaluating the balance. On the other hand, when we look at beginner mode, the numbers typically tweaked by games are also not touched here, but when you start this mode, you're given stat boost items, as well as some extra equipment, one of which even increases your experience if you choose to use it. And there's the important part. You can use what you believe is needed. Do you just want your stats buffed a few points, or maybe a powerful piece of armor, so you can fumble a few more mistakes? Do you constantly want to be overleveled, or do you want to go all out and lean into that unbalanced state? Again, there is still a challenge, still a difficulty curve in beginner, unless you choose to skew that, which at that point, it's not something I would consider a negative. It's an extra option on top of what's already offered. But that's enough about Kingdom Hearts 1. As we make our way back to KH2, we'll see how those mindsets pave the way for the previously mentioned critical mode, as this is where the fun begins. The most appealing aspect to me as a player is the risk versus reward dynamic that comes from critical. No longer is it just the enemies receiving a damage buff, as they do in Proud, but you are as well. It's nothing absurd, mind you. While those enemies get flat double damage, the player receives a buff, making them just 1/4 stronger. And maybe that doesn't seem like a lot on its own, but that's also on top of the fact that this mode starts you with many abilities you normally wouldn't get to much later in the game, such as Reaction Boost, an ability that, as the name implies, makes your reaction commands, the game's situational moves, stronger. Or MP Hystera, an ability that increases how fast your magic points recover, as well as many more. Lastly, the other big buff you receive to coincide with all of these extra abilities is the player gets 50 additional ability points. And as your journey continues, instead of receiving 2 of those points due to level ups, you will be receiving 3. This is notable, as on Beginner, Standard, and Proud, there are times when you have to deal with the AP system as a form of resource management, meaning players have to weigh their options, what's best to equip for the situation. And maybe the limiting factor is a fun thing to consider in some ways, how different people will build their Sora for that point in time. However, the goal of Critical is to put you at your maximum potential. These enemies are going to be coming at you with everything they've got, so the game isn't holding you back. You're coming at them just as hard. That's not to say there are no negatives placed on you though. In this mode, your stat growth is nerfed for HP and MP. So for example, a player on Standard would have their health go up by increments of 5 with level ups, but a player on Critical only gets +2. By the end, halving your max HP pool, making it a mere 60 as opposed to the 120 of other modes. A conscious choice to keep this difficulty more, well, difficult, as without this consideration, all the extra buffs you receive would cause points in the game to actually end up being easier to that of Proud mode for a lot of players. So again, it sticks that landing. It creates a difficult environment, but not one that boils down to tedium. It's demanding you play better, while giving you all the tools to do so. Although, maybe you like that tedium I've been talking down. I sure don't enjoy walking on eggshells and smacking against the HP walls that fill so many games, but it's worth acknowledging that overcoming challenges where the odds are so stacked against you, to the point of it seeming unfair, is a thing some can take pleasure in, even if it's just for bragging rights. Or in some games, inflated HP bars, as well as low damage numbers, allow players to be stylish, juggling enemies for long periods of time. That's where the final piece of Critical comes in, and it brings us back to the earlier topic of options. With all those extra abilities Critical hands you, you're given another called No Experience. This ability actually became such a series staple that they ported it back into Kingdom Hearts 1's Proud mode when it came time for the HD editions. Unlike the other abilities, this does not benefit you, as you can probably guess. If you choose to equip this, you will gain 0 experience throughout your adventure. With your stats hardly leveling, the game becomes a lot harder and not very fair. For people seeking that level of unbalance, the option is there. Maybe you just get too good at the game, where a normal critical run just isn't enough to get your jollies. I mean, it's certainly not unheard of. That's why there's all these insane challenge runs on the internet. Do a level 1 run of a game, do a boss rush without getting hit. Hell, the entire practice of speedrunning is even adjacent to this. I think what it really comes down to is how it's all in the player's hands. Just like the original beginner mode, if you want an unbalanced hurdle that is present in so many games, it's there as a choice. But this is only why, from an analytical standpoint, I think the early entries in this series succeeded where so many games still don't. The thought, the options. It could have gone away with doing as little work as other games. However, the majority of this is still not why I actually think so highly of KH2 in particular, and I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a step back in some ways from the first entry on the beginner side. Although my reasons do come from the result of everything we talked about, the explanation I would give is just far simpler. It's so awesome to choose the hard mode, and it's like a scene in anime where you drop the weights. Suddenly you're more powerful to take on these tough opponents, and like many anime or other works of fiction, that power comes at a price. That's really the best way I can describe it. I often don't have trouble articulating with videos, but unlike a lot of what I talk about, Critical is not complex. At its core, it's a fun, simple, cool as all hell idea that I think many games could learn from. The rush and enjoyment I've gotten conquering these fights were the same highs I've gotten in games like Souls, which had never happened before just from clicking hard mode in other games. And if difficulty modes were often like this, instead of an afterthought in the last week of a game shipping, then yeah, maybe I'd find myself interested in this topic more, but that's unrealistic. Even ignoring games that have difficulty as part of their vision, most devs can't or won't think it's important enough to set aside the time for simple games, yet alone complex ones. In fact, games in this series, once they were handed to the Asaka team, lost pretty much everything I've talked about. Birth by Sleep, the game following immediately, fell into the trapping where the harder difficulties nerfed your output, and at the same time turned everything into those HP sponges. One of my favorite games to play in the series, Dream Drop Distance, made it so Critical removed a large amount of enemy flinching, so you can't even properly combo. Like, really guys.
What were they thinking?
These just aren't fun. KH3 is the first game since Kingdom Hearts 2 to kinda get close, and even that has some caveats. So, all that's to say, Kingdom Hearts 2 Critical Mode is special. And in an age where the difficulty options that are propped up and talked about are essentially just the journalist modes or story modes, as they're frequently called, where the game plays itself, losing out on a core pillar of what games are, I think it's worth talking about that well over a decade ago, this crazy Disney Final Fantasy crossover held so many examples of how to do right by every type of player, one of which that keeps me coming back to this day.
Can you just take your Keyblade flag? I don't want them anymore. Just kidding, they're mine! Wow, I called it.
Good job.
Perfect.
Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you can help me out by clicking the like button, subscribing here on YouTube to my main channel as well as my stream channel, or consider checking out my Patreon. And a special thank you to all those doing that already. Thanks, guys.